Hey folks, happy Wednesday. At least it seems like Wednesday. Sometimes it's hard to remember as some of us are stuck at home with interesting schedules. My name is Mr. Lagerway and I'm an APUSH teacher in Western Michigan, joining you from a lockdown stay-at-home order. Hopefully all of you are staying safe and sane, and wherever you are, remembering to wash your hands a whole lot, maintain that 6 feet of social distancing, and still continuing to be the APUSH bosses that I know you all are. Some of you are like, I don't know what I don't know. So, alrighty. Follow Think Fiveable at a variety of social media platforms if you're wanting to know a bunch of things like that. And then this is what we're going to do in the stream. I want to open it up to your questions and answers. Do the Ask a Question function at the bottom, as Ria is mentioning, yes. And then we're going to talk about political parties and political rights, talk a little bit about CCOT. But again, the whole thing is about questions and answers. I'm trying to be here for you, for all kinds of students all around the world. My students in West Michigan, you students that might be halfway around the world, who knows? So ask questions and we'll dive right in. So questions and concerns that you have, let me go ahead and go to the Ask a Question function. It looks like we're wondering some things. Let's see. Oh, okay, we got some good questions going on. Let me ask a couple of those. So one of them says, should we focus on College Board live sessions since they will be going over Unit 8 topics? No, I just lost it. Hold on. There we go. It got upvoted. Since they'll be going over Unit 8 topics and our class won't talk about it, or would our time be spent better reviewing? So from what I understand, the College Board is doing some live sessions that start with period 8, and then they're going to go backwards and do the ones that are going to be useful for you on the exam. Personally, I would just do whatever your teacher is doing, and thus if your teacher has said, stop the new content, we're just reviewing, then we need to be doing that right now. That's a good idea. So if your teacher has said, we're going to hold off on period 8 and 9 until after the exam, whenever that is, I would maybe not watch the College Board live sessions yet. They're all available on YouTube. There's no rush. Go ahead and watch those later. If your teacher is continuing on through period 8 and 9 just to finish up the whole course and then going to start review, then yeah, I would definitely be watching those now. But your time would be better spent, I think, reviewing if your teacher is not actively requiring you to continue on through period 8 and 9. So that's a good way to talk about it. Let's see, we have a couple other ones. Do we need to know dates of events or laws that are passed? Absolutely, that would be a really great question and definitely something you should know. In fact, for those of you that are into the cram passes that launched the waiting list yesterday or 2 days ago, one of the streams that I'm going to be doing for the cram pass people, because I'm the cram pass teacher, is talking about dates as a strategy for APUSH. So you absolutely should know some dates. There are some really big ones. I think the easiest ones to start off with would be the beginning and the end point of each period. So for period 1, 1491 to 1607, you should know what 1491 stands for, symbolically before Columbus, and then 1607, Jamestown, those kind of things. As you get further into periods 3, 4, and 5, and 6 and 7, you're going to want to do presidential administration years if you can for major presidents. And Pearlie, yes, I'm the teacher for APUSH for the cram passes. So fantastic. I hope you'll be able to join us. Presidential election years, especially big ones like 1800 will be a big deal, 1860, etc. So we have a variety of important dates. They're very, very helpful. The number one feedback that they give us at the AP reading every year from the chief reader is students don't know their dates. They keep writing things that are irrelevant to the time period, and that doesn't work very well. So make sure that you know dates as much as you can. And my advice with dates is always start really big and then sort of work your way down to the minutia and the fine points. So start off with, okay, if it's 1800 to 1850, the first half of the 19th century, what do I know is going on then? Let's see, that's got to be Jefferson, Jackson, Manifest Destiny, Market Revolution, antebellum reform movements. Okay, that gives us a start. If you're talking about the Civil War, the Gilded Age, or Washington, or the Cold War, you're way off, right? So be able to sort of put yourself into maybe 50-year chunks at first, and then work your way down to decades and then to actual years. Frequently, if you look at past APUSH prompts, which are linked on Fiveable, you can also find them on the College Board website. If you look at past College Board prompts, they will frequently have start and end dates for their FRQs, their free response questions. And those start and end dates are going to be very useful for telling you what the College Board thinks are important. If they give you a date that ends in 1754, they're saying before the 7 Years' War, and thus don't worry about revolutionary stuff, just worry about colonial stuff as perhaps one example. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. Let's see. Ari is asking what was decided at the Yalta Conference in February of 1945. So the Yalta Conference is one of those conferences at the end of World War II. It's going to set up the division of Germany after World War II. It's going to set up the Cold War. It's going to set up the United Nations and lots of divisions. Think like Korea eventually is going to be divided north and south. Germany is going to be divided east and west. And the Yalta Conference is going to allow the Soviet Union to establish hegemony or rule over most of Eastern Europe. And then the United States is going to be controlling most of Western Europe, although controlling is a very strong term, right? We were much more cooperative than the Soviet Union was with their satellite states in Eastern Europe. That's kind of period 7, kind of period 8. Be aware that World War II sets up the Cold War tensions. Be aware that World War II has the United States getting along with the Soviet Union at first, but in the Yalta Conference, we start to see some of those tensions rising, particularly as it comes to, did Roosevelt give away too much? How do we deal with Berlin? That'll lead to the Berlin airlift eventually, right? So great question there. Ria is asking about Johnson's Great Society. So let me get into that real quick. Just a reminder that Johnson's Great Society is in period 8. It is not going to be on this year's AP exam. It's a really good, super random, but your school's named after Landon Culver. Awesome. Hey, he's one of my APUSH students here. Johnson's Great Society is in period 8, thus it's not on the AP exam this year, but it's still worth knowing, and it's part of period 8. So Johnson, who is president after Kennedy gets shot, we're talking in the early 60s. Johnson is going to be trying to address poverty and racism. So people lump together all sorts of things into his Great Society. You can also think of this as a New Deal or New Deal 2.0. So FDR's New Deal during the 30s, trying to address the Great Depression. The Great Society is during the mid to late 60s, and it's Johnson trying to address domestic problems at home. So this would include things like the Civil Rights Act of 64 that outlaws segregation. This would be the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Housing Rights Act of 68. Then the big programs that come along with it are things like Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, which is preschool for people that can't afford to go to preschool. The National Endowment for the Arts and National Endowment for the Humanities. So again, things that enrich and enliven our culture as a country and then try to lift people out of poverty. Medicare, remember, and Medicaid are slightly different. Medicare is for the elderly, healthcare, etc. Medicaid is for the poor. Think if you aid the poor, you care for your grandparents. That's how I remember it, at least. So that's one way to go about it. Johnson's Great Society largely is a success. I mean, a lot of its programs still exist today, like the New Deal. But it's very controversial. A lot of conservatives don't like it. There's going to be a backlash against that in the 1970s and 80s, particularly with Ronald Reagan. And also be aware that the Great Society perhaps fails to live up to its full potential because so much of its funding is funneled away through Johnson's foreign policy, that is the Vietnam War, which just explodes over the 60s, no pun intended, and takes over pretty much everything else. So that's the Great Society in a nutshell. Remember, that's not going to be on the exam, but still worth knowing about. Let's see. Ria's asking about similarities between political parties over time, like how they started and finished, and which ones stemmed for others, and Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Oh, man. Isaiah, Ria, you've come to the right stream. We're talking about political parties all day today, so that'll be great. Let me just go over the other ones real quick. Aries talking about what were some incidences that fueled Stalin's mistrust of the United States. So a variety of things. First of all, Stalin just distrusted the United States because, remember, we invaded Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. We tried to aid the White Russians. We tried to strangle the Red Army in its infancy. And so that was under Wilson right after World War I. We didn't like the Soviet Union. We refused to trade with them. It's all really, really bad. Then just the fact that we're communist and we're capitalist and they're communist, we don't get along, sure. And the only reason we were even friends at all was during World War II. We both saw the enemy as Adolf Hitler together, so we fought against him. He didn't trust us for a variety of reasons during the war. One, he thought we dragged our feet too much in establishing a second front. The Soviet Union bore the brunt of the German army. 4 out of 5 German people that died, 80%, died in the Eastern Front facing the Soviets. And he thought we were dragging our feet such that the Soviets and the Germans would fight and bleed each other dry until we could get in there and sort of be the best and the big conqueror at the very end. Senator Harry Truman, later to be FDR's vice president and then becomes president, was actually quoted during World War II as saying, well, if the Soviets are winning, we should help the Nazis. If the Nazis are winning, we should help the Soviets. because if Nazis and communists fight each other, awesome. We like that because we hate both of them. Let them kill each other. So there's some distrust there. Also, the United States does not tell Stalin about the development of the nuclear bomb. The Manhattan Project is cooperative with Canada and the United Kingdom, but not with the Soviet Union. And so the United States develops atomic weapons and then uses them without telling the Soviets, although Truman kind of hints at it to Stalin when they come together at the Tehran conference. Are colloquialisms such as dragging our feet viable on the exam? I would say so, yeah. Yeah, great question. I mean, if they know what you're talking about, yeah, I wouldn't use super obscure ones, but if you talk about dragging our feet, delay, you could say, to be more, I guess, technical there. But yeah, that would be fine. They would know what you mean. The United States uses the atomic bombs on Japan partially because we want to avoid invading them, but partially because we want to flex on the Soviets and tell them not to mess with us in post-war Europe. So there's some distrust there. Great questions. Naya is asking, can we go over the big picture ideas from each period and see somehow how everything connects briefly? Let's do that at the end, at the last part of the questions and answer session, because that could potentially take us a long time. So great question. Let's see. Logan was asking in the chat, so does the exam not have an essay given it will be 45 minutes? We honestly don't know. 45 minutes could theoretically include some sort of LEQ almost in its entirety. It could be some sort of modified DBQ. It could be a bunch of short answer questions. The only thing we know for sure right now is that it is free response questions, or FRQs, which for APUSH means no multiple choice questions, and no multiple choice questions for any AP classes at all. It'll all be free response, aka writing, or since it'll be taken out on a computer, probably typing. So if you had to ask me, and this is pure speculation, so don't quote me on this at all, I were to guess that the APUSH exam and other AP histories would be something like 3 short answer questions that you could do in 45 minutes. That would make sense given the time period. That would be really nice, but no, that just wouldn't work. Perla talking about grid-ins. Do those count as FRQs? I don't teach a subject that uses grid-ins, so I'm not very familiar with them. My guess is if it's like a math or a STEM focused one where you have to like write an actual answer, could be. But either way, as Zaria is pointing out, yes, for every single AP subject, we are going to find out what type of paper we're going to write on April 3. That's what it's going to be. Yeah. So on April 3, you should find out the exam times. There's going to be 2 different exam times, as I told us so far, an early and a late one. Take it while you're fresh. Take it while you have more time to study. We'll find out more about that on April 3. Let's see. And Landon Culver does have a school and a restaurant chain. Fantastic. Now I want a concrete mixer. Shoot, I'm all hungry now. Yeah, we're going to find out on April 3 a whole lot more about what our different exams are going to look like. Keep an eye on that College Board website. Continue to look for updates there, and follow AP Trevor on Twitter if you're on Twitter and you want to get some updates there. That's where he confirmed the no multiple choice, etc. Yeah. Ari, different visions of the Soviets in the United States. That's another period 8 question. Let's deal with that at the end. But thanks for asking that. Let me dive in here now to, unless we have other pressing questions of earlier stuff, let's dive into talking about political parties over time and their major divisions. So here we go. I know some of you are really excited about this. Perla, I think you were excited about this. And Isaiah, you asked about Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So one thing to keep in mind about the Federalists and Anti-Federalists is that they are not political parties that exist while the United States has the Constitution. People often get these confused, right? The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists exist for one purpose only, and they're basically one-issue parties. Well, go ahead and throw this in the chat. This will be my first question for you folks. What are the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists disagreeing about? What's their main beef with each other? What are they disagreeing on? I'll give you a hint via a date. Federalists and Anti-Federalists are going to be talking about, let's say 1787, 1788 or so. And Timmel, yeah, nice job. This is going to be the Constitution, and everyone else is right too. Yes, yes. So the Federalists and Anti-Federalists are all about debating the Constitution. If you're not talking about the Constitutional Convention, you're probably not, you're not talking about Anti-Federalists. Federalists will often become Federalists, the party, later on, but not all of them. For instance, who are the 3 gentlemen who write the Federalist Papers arguing that the United States should ratify the Constitution? Who are the 3 men Let's test your Hamilton knowledge here. Who are the three men that write the Federalist Papers? We got Hamilton, we got John Jay, and Susan got the last one, James Madison. James Madison will become exactly. I thought of the song too. Yeah, absolutely. The work evenly divided among the three men. Hamilton's a great musical, and it's fantastic. Hamilton wrote the other 51. So some of you were writing like you were running out of time. Isaiah took a little bit of time and wrote them all out. Fantastic. Nice job. So the reason I bring this up is because it illustrates that Hamilton and John Jay become Federalists, the party later on who advocate for a stronger centralized government. Madison, he's not an anti-federalist. He wants the Constitution to get ratified. However, once the Constitution is ratified and starts happening, he begins to align more with the Democratic Republicans, who are a little bit more small government. So just be aware of that. If you're talking about anti-federalists, you have to be talking about the Constitution, its ratification, local states' rights versus national strong government, that kind of stuff during 1787, 1788. Absolutely. All right, let me close off the question and answer thing. So that's kind of a preview here. The first party system then is going to emerge during Washington's administration. Perla, is the musical actually accurate enough to study from? I would say yes. Yep. There are things that are inaccurate in the musical, but not that would detract you from APUSH at all. In fact, some students used these very effectively on a DBQ a few years ago about the American Revolution, when they mentioned like Farmer Refuted, or they mentioned Reading Common Sense by Thomas Paine, stuff like that. Yeah, exactly. Time to go watch it right now. Studying. It will not substitute for a comprehensive period 3 studying session, but yes, it's certainly worth your time. So first party system is going to be 1792-ish to about 1820 or so. This emerges during Washington's administration. We're going to dive deeper into this. Remember, this is Federalists and Democratic Republicans. Second party system happens next after the era of good feelings collapses, and that's going to be Democrats versus Whigs. To simplify a little bit here, we're going to sort of give you the broad overview now, and then we'll dive into the details on the next slides. We got the third party system, and that's going to be Democrats and Republicans. Now, technically, the third party system is only going to be this time period right here. This is the fourth, the fifth, and maybe the sixth party system, but Democrats and Republicans are going to be the only major two political parties after 1854. So be aware, if you're comparing and contrasting, if you're studying and you're looking for good compare contrast CCOT stuff, this is where you want to go. So those are the major divisions of political parties. Let's dive into this first political party system. By the way, if you haven't seen the American History Political Parties poster by David Walbert, I highly recommend that you check it out. You can go to davidwalbert.com at some point after the stream, of course. And it has this whole thing. You can get it as a PDF. It's free to distribute, free to use, and very fantastic for studying. I find it very helpful. I'm a very visual person, and I like colors, and I like being able to see the years, and it makes a lot of sense. So first party system. George Washington is technically not part of a political party. He's technically just a person running for office. But then during his second term, you can kind of actually see this. During the second term, the parties start to emerge. Democratic Republicans led by Thomas Jefferson, his Secretary of State, and then the Federalists led by John Adams, his Vice President, Alexander Hamilton, his Secretary of Treasury, and they start to have disagreements on a variety of things. So be aware that then John Adams becomes the first Federalist president. Technically, Thomas Jefferson becomes the first Democratic Republican president, and the Federalists only have one president ever in their entire history, and they kind of collapse after 1815 and shoot themselves in the foot with the Hartford Convention. So what are their differences? Well, I want to ask you folks first before I put up a next slide and kind of show you a bit of an answer key here. What are some differences or main issues upon which these two parties are going to disagree? Feel free to give me the topic or to give me the position. Federalists believe in what? Democratic Republicans believe in what? What are some of the issues? Ria's talking about states' rights. Absolutely. Which political party likes more power to the states and less to the federal government? Kind of gave you a little bit of a hint there. Yeah, anti-federalists, but remember, that's only with the Constitution. At this point, you want to talk about Federalists or Democratic Republicans, right? Because now we have actual political parties. We are under the Constitution. It's been ratified. So they're talking about national banks, states' rights, federal power, loose and strict constructionism. Absolutely. Your loose constructionists, that is, let's stretch the Constitution to let it do more, that's going to be the Federalists, especially think Hamilton's financial plan. The banks, Hamilton's financial plan establishes banks. The Constitution doesn't say you can establish banks, but it does use the necessary and proper clause to say that we can make banks because it's necessary for us to do our other things. In general, Federalists are more in favor of a strong federal government. Democratic Republicans are more in favor of states being more powerful as a check on the national government. Yeah, we got some good stuff going on there. Let's see. I'm just going to check in with the questions and answers here. We got ourselves. What happened at the Hartford Convention? Yeah, let's get to that at the end of this section here. So first party system looks a little bit like this. So the Federalists, remember, originally refers to supporters of the federal Constitution. They want a strong national bank. They like promoting commerce, manufacturing, banking. They're not just all about being yeoman farmers. They did not like the people as much. They tended to be a little bit suspicious of democracy. Thus, the Federalists would support things like a Supreme Court or a Senate. Supreme Court is appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. No people get to vote on that. The Electoral College, that could subvert the will of the people, although it really doesn't ever do that. The Senate is not directly elected by people at first. They like that sort of stuff. They tend to support England in its wars with France, which includes the famous Hamilton, sir, draft a statement of neutrality, right? That Washington says. So Washington's statement of neutrality says, we're not going to take part in this England and France war, which means we're essentially taking England's side. They don't want to be part of England. They want independence like everybody else does. But they want to model themselves off of England, given their elitism and trade preferences. They tend to be urban. They tend to be more business and upper class peoples, and they tend to be very strong in New England. In fact, that's the only place that they're even viable by the end of the 1790s, let's say. The Democratic Republicans, by contrast, they're led by Thomas Jefferson, and they are going to be, let's see. Sorry, I'm just checking out the questions here. They want more democracy, more states' rights, more local. They like France a whole lot more, given its anti-aristocratic principles. They are more farmers. They tend to be workers and craftsmen in towns. They tend to be a bit more rural. And much like Jefferson, they want the United States to be a bit more agrarian, let's say, or agricultural. So when does this end? Well, it ends about in 1820 with the election of, which president was elected in 1820? Don't look it up. See what you can do. Which presidency establishes the era of good feelings and ends the first party system? Might be a good idea. Yes, Monroe. It's Monroe. By the way, another way you can know this is because the Monroe Doctrine is a date you should know, and that's 1823. And Monroe has to be president in 1820. Well, elected in 1820, becomes president in 1821, of course, if he's going to issue the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. So this Monroe is going to be president in 1820. That ends the first party system. It starts the era of good feelings. Obviously, the era of good feelings is a bit of a misnomer. Even though the Federalists were gone, Democratic Republicans still argued about a variety of things. There were sectional tensions, think Missouri Compromise of 1820, etc. So when does this party system start to end? I would say, and to answer Isaiah's question here, this would be the Hartford Convention. The Hartford Convention is in 1815, and that's when a bunch of Federalists get together during the War of 1812 and in Hartford, Connecticut, and complain about the war. And they issue a series of demands, including proposed constitutional changes that would make it necessary to have a 2/3 vote in order to go to war. Excuse me. This was their way of protecting their own political power, making sure that they couldn't be steered by the Western and Southern war hawks of the Democratic Republicans into war. They didn't like the War of 1812. The problem with this is their timing is terrible. So remember the War of 1812. It lasts from 1812 to 1815 or so. The United States gets a bunch of news. One, they get the news of the Treaty of Ghent that ends the War of 1812. Hooray, we didn't lose. And the United States actually thinks that it won. So they're feeling all nationalistic and rah, USA, USA. And then they get news of the Battle of New Orleans, where Andrew Jackson beat a bunch of British people in New Orleans after the war technically ended because of the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, but they just didn't get news yet because, slow ships crossing the Atlantic getting news would take a while. So they get news. Not only did we not lose the war, we kind of won. We creamed the British in a really humiliating large defeat. War hero Andrew Jackson, rah, rah, USA, USA. And then the third piece of news is a bunch of whiny Federalists up in New England are saying, well, we don't like this war, change the Constitution or we might secede. Where? Well, it's just terrible timing, right? And so the Federalists kind of shoot themselves in the foot there because they're complaining about a war that the United States thinks is, well, they won and they think it's pretty popular. So that basically ends the Federalist Party, and after 1816, they don't really have a candidate for president, and they kind of disappear as a party. Naya, was there an embargo issued during the War of 1812? Yes, that's one of the predecessors. 1807, Jefferson issues the Embargo Act, and then you have Macon's Bill No. 2, the Non-Intercourse Act, things like that, and that's when the United States is trying to not trade with anybody, and it turns out disastrously. Oh, very close. Yeah. The United States, that's part of the road to 1812. Yeah, good thoughts. All right, so getting on to the second party system then. This is a picture of the time period from the second party system. Oh boy. Oh, don't touch your face. But wow, this is really complicated. Don't let this scare you too much, but do let it show that antebellum politics were cray-cray bananas. That's a technical historical term. So the Democrats stay pretty consistent. Now in 1824, there's a whole bunch of Democratic candidates. There's Andrew Jackson, William Crawford, Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams. That's the corrupt bargain election. It's pretty nuts. There's 4 people involved. John Quincy Adams becomes president, but they're all Democratic Republicans. They just disagree with each other on a variety of things. The Democrats stay fairly consistent during this time period, but the anti-Jackson forces, especially by 1828, are going to call themselves the National Republicans at first. Then they're going to have a whole bunch of different people running for president, eventually becoming themselves the Whig Party. They're only going to elect 2 presidents. That'd be William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor. But you do need to be aware that the Whigs exert a very large force during this time period. They're one of the major political parties. Let's talk about that a little bit. Eventually, they're going to collapse by 1854, and we'll talk about that next. So, second party system. It emerges from a split in the Democratic-Republican Party. Basically, you have the pro-Jackson Party and the anti-Jackson Party. The Democratic Party is going to be the pro-Jackson Party. They're still believing in small government, still believing in states' rights, still opposing banks, still being largely the party of farmers, of agrarian United States. A lot of people from southern places, frontier areas, a lot of immigrants, things like that. So the Democratic Party is really the inheritor of the Democratic-Republican Party. Eventually, it just becomes the pro-Jackson Democratic Party. The Whigs, by contrast, are going to be the new Federalists. So they still want Congress to be stronger than the president. They don't like an imperial presidency under Andrew Jackson, the military chieftain. They support more industry. They support a variegated economy, a varied economy. I believe it was Daniel Walker Howe who said that in his fantastic book, What Hath God Wrought? The Democrats wanted a country that was economically homogenous, that is economically the same. Everyone should be a small yeoman farmer, and yet culturally heterogeneous or culturally pluralistic. You can be different. You're okay to be a Catholic immigrant, an immigrant of different kinds. You're welcome to come in here, bring your new stuff, and change it all up. That's fine. The Whigs, by contrast, wanted the United States to be economically heterogeneous. Think heterogeneous and homogeneous mixtures in chemistry, maybe. The Whigs are going to be okay with having some farmers, some manufacturers, some investors, some bankers, a whole bunch of different stuff in the economy. But culturally, the Whigs, who were pretty elitist, wanted the United States to be fairly similar culturally. So they were the proponents behind much of the antebellum reform movements. They were the ones saying, you shouldn't be drinking liquor, temperance, between slavery, abolition, and things like that. They tended to be, again, from cities, again, tended to be fairly conservative Protestants, New England types, and so this is very much like the Federalists. Naya asked, was there a shift in ideals from the National Republicans to the Whigs, the name change, or was there the same anti-Jackson feelings as before? Yeah, basically, same anti-Jackson feelings. It's going to be more that the Whigs eventually turn out to be not the anti-Jackson party. They turn out to stand for something, right? So you can only be anti-Jackson as long as Jackson is running for president. Once he's not running anymore, you kind of need to have your own program. So the Whigs will eventually just become the National Republicans, becoming a full, long-lasting sort of political party. But largely you can think of them as the same. So if you see National Republicans, think of Henry Clay and his American system, stuff like that. So Whigs like things like building the national road, increasing funding for canals, for railroads, internal improvements. They also appreciate a tariff or a tax on imported goods in order to support local manufacturing. The Democrats did not like that because they thought it hurt Southern farmers, etc. Although the Democrats will, of course, write several of the tariff systems the United States has, including the one in the 1850s right before the Civil War. There are a lot of third parties active during the second party system. The Great Compromise of 1850 is more like with slavery and westward expansion, but there is a tariff that's written around that time. I want to say 1857 is when one's written, and maybe 1852. Don't quote me on that. A lot of tariffs during that time period. But Compromise of 1850 is California, Free State, Fugitive Slave Act, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And that's when the second party system is going to degrade. So the second party system ends, as you can see, and let me just turn this into a pointer because that's a little bit better. It ends in 1854. So what happens in 1854 that's going to cause the collapse of the second party system? Largely the collapse of the Whig Party, although there will be some defections from the Democratic Party as well. What event happens in 1854 that causes the parties to collapse? Sierra's got it. Nice job. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. Absolutely. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, which, remember, undoes the Missouri Compromise. It's going to lead to the Whigs collapsing because there are so-called cotton Whigs, a.k.a. pro-slavery Southern Whigs, and conscience Whigs, a.k.a. abolitionist Whigs. And they're going to leave the party. And then the new party that's going to come as a result, that's the anti-Kansas-Nebraska Act party. It's going to take some anti-slavery Democrats, some Northern Democrats, some conscience Whigs. It's going to take some Liberty Party people, some Free Soilers, some anti-Masonic Party people, and American Party Know-Nothing people, and combine it into this big conglomerate party that's against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, known as what? Put that in the chat there. What's the party that takes the place of the Whigs in the 1850s, thanks to the anti-Kansas-Nebraska Act stance? Isaiah, nice job. You got that too. I see you. What's the party that emerges in 1854? 1856 is their first time they run someone for president. They will not succeed, even though it's a war hero. Their first time succeeding will be in 1860 with a certain man named Abraham Lincoln. We seem to be a little bit confuzzled or a little bit behind. Isaiah's got it. Republicans, yes. National Union will be later in 1864. That's during the Civil War. Perla, nice job. Yeah, this is the Republican Party that'll be coming up. So let's talk about this third-party system. The third-party system is going to involve Republicans and Democrats, although it gets a little bit funky in the middle there. I wouldn't worry about that too much. Largely, though, the Republicans are going to be the anti-Kansas-Nebraska Act party, and the Democrats are going to be the more Southern, thus pro-slavery party, and then anti-Lincoln party, and then anti-Civil War party, and then we're going to get into period 6 a little bit. So let's talk about this a little bit. So it's all about slavery initially, right? Slavery is the cause of the Civil War. It's the cause of the collapse of the second party system. It's the cause of the rise of the Republicans. And again, they're going to adopt, Republicans are going to be very much like the Whigs, right? So they like industry, they like urbanization, they like education, they like unity and expansion of national interests. So the Republicans are going to be the ones that are going to pass the national, the Intercontinental Railroad Act. They're going to be the ones that pass the Homestead Act and the Moral Land Grant Act and things like that. They are more likely to support things like prohibition and temperance. Again, like the Whigs, they tend to be a little bit more elitist and a little bit more tisk, shouldn't be doing that. And again, African-American males are now able to vote after 1870, and they're going to vote heavily Republican because Lincoln frees the slaves, and the Democrats were not so kind to African-Americans back then. No connection to today, of course. So I just mentioned this actually just briefly, but I want to emphasize this one more time. Once you get to the third-party system, you see Democrats and Republicans. One of the mistakes that too many of our, shall we say, less educated people nowadays will say is, ooh, Democrats, Republicans, those are the same parties from today. I bet I can draw all sorts of conclusions and lots of good zingers to zing my other party. Like, you Republicans, you're the people that did all this bad stuff during the 1880s with corruption. Well, not really the same thing. Democrats were the party of the KKK. That's true, but it's also conservative Democrats. You couldn't say conservatives are the belief system of the KKK. That just gets really messy. So don't use really bad history to score political points, and fight it with good history, right? These have nothing to do with today's political parties for the most part, partially because the Democrats are Southern and conservative, whereas nowadays Republicans are the ones that are Southern and conservative, right? Just a really easy example there. So Republicans are very Whig-like. Democrats continue to be the same during this time period. So they are ones that are trying to keep African Americans from voting. They tend to be more conservative. They tend to have more support from farmers, from immigrants still. They tend to have still a low tariff. They want the government to largely stay out. They tend to want to have more states' rights, which includes regulating things like a tariff. The national government's the only one that can institute a tariff. So keep it low, and that way states can regulate their own trade a little bit. Keep it low, keep the federal government small, so that way they can preserve their slavery and things like that. And then they are eventually controlled by northern businessmen after the Civil War, but the Democrats continue to be the party of extreme racism and extreme prejudice down south, as they still maintain their conservative pre-Civil War antebellum era ideas even after the Civil War. This is going to last until about 1896 or so. So you're going to see this happening during the Gilded Age. Republicans tend to be more on the side of big business, but largely the party differences begin to sort of disappear after the end of Reconstruction in 1877. During the Gilded Age, both parties tend to take the side of businessmen, tend to be against the workers, although the Republican Party, certainly by the 1890s, is even more pro-business. All right, fourth party system, our last one for today-ish. Well, yeah, we'll do 4.5. And that's this one. This is the fourth party system, and it's going to be the Democrats and the Republicans. Notice we have a prohibition party at the bottom there, and the populist and socialist parties as well. You need to be aware of those a little bit, partially because everyone and their mother is going to claim to be progressive at a certain point. And notice the Progressive Party kind of pops up in the middle there too. So what are our big differences here? The Republicans dominated this fourth party system. The Republicans are really, really strong in the industrial North, and they tend to be dominated by business interests. So a lot of pro-business people, especially McKinley in 1896. Remember, huge spending by businessmen to get McKinley elected over William Jennings Bryan, and they're going to spend all sorts of new money to be able to make sure that happens. The United States becomes very involved in international affairs, flexes that muscle, and the Republican Party tends to be pretty nationalistic at first, and then they're isolationist a little bit later. So Democrats continue to be supported by farmers, especially in the West, but there's dwindling support for the Democrats, especially as the progressive reformers start to come up. People like William Jennings Bryan are going to be Democrats, but also progressives and populists. Progressives, remember, are the people that try to fix the problems of the Gilded Age. Populists are going to be the ones that are pro-farmer. Now I ask, which party wanted free silver coinage and why? That's going to be mostly the populists and slightly Democrats. Republicans, for sure, during this time period, as the party of big business, they're going to want the gold standard, no silver coinage at all. The Democrats, occasionally, like William Jennings Bryan, cross of gold speech, right? He will want free coinage of silver. That's mostly a populist idea, and it'll get adopted by the Democratic Party in, say, 1896, 1900 or so. Let's see. Democrats down south continue to be very economically conservative. Yep, they tend to be supported by immigrants, still a whole lot, yes. And then the Republicans tend to be supported more by women, partially thanks to their pro-prohibition stance, right? They're more against alcohol. But then, of course, after World War I, until in the 1920s, when you get the Republican presidents of Harding and Coolidge, Republicans are going to be very hands-off, very pro-business, and very small government. And toward the end of that, with Hoover, much to the detriment of the United States, as the regulations get relaxed, the Great Depression happens, and there's a huge crash, right? So the fourth party system. I hesitate to say this because I know some people will get really mad at me for saying this, but the third and the fourth party systems, I would say, are not quite as important as the first, the second, and the fifth. The first and the second, aka Federalists and Democratic Republicans, very important. Whigs and Democrats, also very important. third and fourth party systems, they tend to be fairly similar, and they don't tend to ask a lot of questions on this. You can get really into the weeds during the Gilded Age and during this time period, but be aware that then during this time period, during the fourth party system, everybody tries to be progressive for a while. So there's Teddy Roosevelt, who's a Republican, there's Taft, who's a Republican, and there's Woodrow Wilson, who's a Democrat, and they all claim to be progressive. So be aware of that a little bit too. Then it's going to change in 1932 with the election of FDR. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who rises to the presidency during the Great Depression, starts the New Deal, and this is largely going to last until the 1860s. I kind of cut it off there because, remember, for our purposes here in APUSH, we're done after 1945 at the end of period 7. So big differences there. The Republican Party does not support as much big business, and they start to be, well, FDR brings together this thing called the New Deal Coalition that includes working class white people, African Americans, Southern white people, and man, the Democratic Party is very, very divided, even in the South. But FDR and his New Deal is fairly segregated. So it's progressive in the sense that it's helping out people and it's progressing and it's expanding the federal government. But it's certainly not going to be progressive in the sense of civil rights, unfortunately. So it's going to support things like the Great Society, like the New Deal, so Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and it's going to very much support the United States' involvement in World War II. Republicans, by contrast, are going to have a moderate and a conservative wing. They largely don't like the big government programs of the New Deal and the Great Society. They're going to be very strong on national defense, very anti-communist eventually, and then they're going to oppose some civil rights legislation and some racial equality at the same time sometimes. This is going to switch in 1968 because of Johnson's support for the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. We don't really need to get into that a whole lot. That's in period 8. But be aware that the parties start to take on their modern day left and right, conservative, Republican, liberal, democratic functions after 1968. So that'll happen a little bit later. Whew, that was a lot of political party stuff. Let me go over some other things real quick. Isaiah asked, we were just saying, why did Republicans oppose civil rights legislation? So we kind of talked about this in one of the earlier ones, but I would say that some Republicans oppose civil rights because they're more small government and they tend to be more conservative. Remember, we had conservatives and liberals in both parties kind of mixed all together, but then during the 1960s with Johnson, they are going to be more sorted and separated. So you're going to see a whole bunch of Southern Democrats who are very conservative switch over to the Republican Party because they don't like Johnson, who was a Southern Democrat, supporting this liberal policy of civil rights, etc. Some of it comes from a small government perspective. Don't tell me what to do. Don't tread on me. Stay out of my backyard kind of thing. Part of it comes from a traditional or conservative view of race relations. Some of it comes from opposition to integration of public schools, things like that. Yeah. Perla asked a good question. How does the vice presidency work? Can they be from different parties or are they from the same party? They could be from different parties, but they usually are. Sorry, just dropped my remote a second. They usually are from the same party. They can be from different ones. One of the ones Perla, that you mentioned earlier is the National Union Party, and that's where Lincoln, a Republican, chooses Johnson, a Democrat, to be a both National Union ticket, so that way during the Civil War they can bring the country together. That almost never happens. But yeah, they usually don't because of their views. Thanks, Isaiah. Excellent answer. So that's your fifth party system that takes us through 1945. I think we're pretty good there. Let's see. All right, I have one more thing to do with political parties, and that's talking about different kinds of rights. So we'll get to questions and concerns in just a second. Political rights, let's talk about those real quick, and then we'll get to more of your questions. You have some in the Ask a Question function. If you have more about politics, ask those in the chat. That'd be a good idea. So there's voting rights. Can you think of SFI or vocab or specific factual information, historical items that might deal with voting rights? This is kind of where we start to see the CCOT, right? The change in continuity over time. Voting rights are a constant in political U.S. history. You should be aware of some of these things. Throw out some examples in the chat. What sort of voting rights things? Poll taxes. The 19th Amendment, poll taxes, you have to pay to vote. Civil Rights Act, 19th Amendment, women can vote. Yeah. Grandfather clauses. Poll taxes and grandfather clauses are both going to be loopholes in what amendment that's allegedly allowing people to vote. Literacy tests are going to be another one. Yeah. After Reconstruction ends, they begin to use those to undermine the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment. A lot of you said 14. Yeah, I'll give you a way to remember that in just a second. So 15th Amendment, social status is a part of political rights too. Do you have the ability to run for office, to be able to be a first-class citizen, to be able to be treated like everybody else? Some examples of that would be the 14th Amendment, maybe. Representation. Do you have the ability to be represented, to run for office yourself? Think of the Great Compromise that happens in the Constitutional Convention with Roger Sherman, sometimes called the Connecticut Plan. You're going to have small states and large states represented differently. So the large states get more representation in the House of Representatives. Small states get equal representation in the Senate, which leads to all sorts of interesting issues. Sorry, my box is covering that up. That says federalism and the 17th Amendment. So federalism is a great example of political rights. How does that change over time? Is the national government stronger? Are state governments stronger? The 17th Amendment is the direct election of senators. That's going to change during the progressive era. And then issues of citizenship. Examples of citizenship that you can think of. When does citizenship become an issue for the United States? When is it debated? Parallel with the large and small state plans, you have to know the states they're associated with, like small state New Jersey plan, large state Virginia plan. Not necessarily, no. If you were, you could. It's all FRQs, right? So you could use that as some examples, but I wouldn't feel like you feel compelled to memorize those. 1920s with immigration quotas, fantastic. Yes, the National Origins Act of 1924, the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, Immigration Act of 1924, absolutely. I just finished it was a pretty good book. Called Impossible Subjects, Illegal Immigrants and the Making of Modern America by Ngai, not sure how to pronounce it, Ngai. Anyway, all about Chinese exclusion and the National Origins Act and all those kinds of things. Yes, so a variety of examples there. 14th Amendment, Chinese exclusion, the 1790 Naturalization Act that says you can only be a naturalized citizen if you're white. Super racist, lasts for a long time. So how do you remember all these? Here's a sentence that I teach my students. Free citizens vote to tax senators who drink with women. For citizenship, can you talk about the territories? Yes. The insular cases, they don't get citizenship, or at least not fully, right? They're American nationals sometimes. Timmel, fantastic. I like it. So that's the sentence I teach my students to remember the 13th through the 19th Amendments. Check this out. Free citizens vote to tax senators who drink with women. I don't remember who came up with that first. That's not a Mr. Lagerway creation at all, but man, is that helpful because you need to know those amendments, right? Those are very important ones. You need to know the first three as part of Reconstruction. The next four are part of the progressive era. If you want to add one and you don't get too confused, I like to add equal citizens because the 14th Amendment, remember, is equality under the law, but also citizenship for everyone born in the United States. So free and equal citizens vote to tax senators who drink with women. So 13th Amendment frees the slaves. 14th Amendment gives everybody born in the United States citizenship, and they're supposed to be treated equal. Not true because of Jim Crow laws, right? Separate but equal. 15th Amendment gives voting rights to African-American males. African-American women will not truly get the right to vote until 1968, at least. Taxation. Income tax becomes eligible after the 16th Amendment. The direct election of senators happens in the 17th Amendment. Prohibition happens with the 18th Amendment. When you're 18, you can't drink. You can remember actually then that you're able to drink when you're 21 in the United States. So 21 is the one that repeals prohibition. And then women get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. So this is pretty helpful. Free citizens vote to tax senators who drink with women. You can remember the 13th or 19th. If you want to talk about women being lame ducks, you can remember the 20th Amendment with FDR and the lame duck amendment when they moved the presidential inauguration from March to January. There's also then the 21st Amendment that repeals prohibition in the United States. Again, you can drink when you're 21. That's the way I remember that one. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful, right? All those amendments. There's a quick sentence to remember. Should be helpful. Let me go back a little bit. We can talk about political movements and groups, but you folks had some questions that I'd like to be able to answer before we run out of time here. Drink with women and lame ducks. All right. So Ari was asking about the visions of the Soviets in the United States. Remember the Soviets' goal, so now we're jumping into period 8 a little bit. The Soviets' goal after World War II was to prevent another invasion from a place like Germany. So they wanted to lock down Eastern Europe. They wanted to spread communism, get as many friends as they possibly could that were also communist. The United States wanted to make the world safe for democracy and to be able to spread democracy, to be able to make sure that they could contain communism. So the Soviet Union is trying to expand communism. The United States is trying to contain communism. And thus we had fundamentally different roles of what the world was going to look like after World War II. Capitalist and democratic for the United States sometimes, and very communistic for the Soviets. Let's see. We wanted to go over big picture ideas from each period and how everything connects briefly, and then review on period 7. That's going to be some big stuff. Let's talk about political movements and groups, and then we'll go back and do that with whatever time we have left. Sound good? So just to be able to cover the political rights stuff, keep in mind you're going to be wanting to keep an eye on a variety of groups. Women, for sure. By the way, I had a fantastic question from a student of mine in a different class that was saying, like, why do we always focus on all of these groups? Like, whatever happened to just calling everybody American? Like, why are we playing identity politics? They didn't use that word. The reason that we often focus on a lot of these groups is because, yes, they are all Americans, but they're not all being treated like Americans. And so in order to figure out how people were not treated as Americans, you have to sometimes look at the marginalized groups. Look at the margins, look at those that are being discriminated against, and then you can see, okay, the United States starts out trying to become this perfect, let's say, equal circle, but it starts out as kind of a square. And you have to kind of add more and more sides to the polygon by chipping away at different sorts of discrimination for different kinds of groups, hopefully getting closer and closer to that perfect democratic equal circle. I don't know if that made a lot of sense to you, but hopefully those of you that are taking a math course, you know, as a circle is a polygon with an infinite number of sides, right? So as the limit approaches infinity, we're going to get closer and closer. So the United States begins with this ideal of a circle, but it starts out as maybe even a triangle, and then you have to keep chipping away, and you get rid of more and more segregation and more discrimination as you go. The larger chunks go first, right? Getting rid of slavery was a big deal, but that doesn't mean that African Americans are suddenly all equal, right? So glad some of you liked that analogy. I like it. So women, you can talk about Anne Hutchinson, Abigail Adams, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Be aware that these are some of the themes that will crop up on the APUSH exam all the time. Be able to think about that. Think about Republican motherhood, or Republican motherhood is going to be during the early period 3 kind of stuff. Then you're going to get the cult of domesticity, etc. Deborah Sampson, the one that dressed up as a man to fight in the war. Absolutely. Lot of examples. Way too many to list here, but nice job, Rhea. Good job. African Americans, examples of this would be like abolition, Frederick Douglass, Reconstruction, W.E.B. Du Bois. Think about the common men and how there's going to be examples of, like, do you need land to vote? How about Andrew Jackson and universal white manhood suffrage? You were able to vote if you were a white man during the time of Andrew Jackson, which was a change from before. And then immigrants, continue to think about their rights and how that changes over time. Initially, it's going to be Irish and Germans, right? The scary, scary Catholics that Thomas Nast is all concerned about. The rise of the Know Nothing Party, the American Party in the 1840s, and then the Mexicans that are actually coming into the United States, or the United States comes over to them and takes away, suddenly annexes all of that land during the Mexican-American War and the Mexican Cession, and they become part of the United States as well. And how does the United States deal with that? And then the Chinese Exclusion Act and Southern Europeans. Some of you mentioned the Immigration Act of 1924, etc. Be aware of some of those things. So what I'm doing right here is I'm not trying to give you a comprehensive review of every single political movement or group ever. What I am trying to say is, if they give you a prompt that has something to do with politics, think about the previous slide where it was talking about different kinds of rights. Then think about this slide. What are the different kinds of groups that had to fight for rights? They can give you a prompt that's entirely on women's rights. Maybe compare Republican motherhood with the cult to domesticity. Maybe compare Abigail Adams with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Maybe they're going to talk about African Americans and how their rights changed over time from before the Civil War to after to even later. You just don't know. But if they give you a wide option, this is one way to sort of structure your essays. Think about the political rights themselves, but also think about the groups that fought for these rights. and the various people involved. So that's one way to do it. Again, start big and then get smaller into more detail. Let me get into your questions. Let's see. My AP teacher mentioned that on the exam they give you vocab and then ask you to relate to all of it with a prompt. Is that true? No, I don't think so. Unless they're talking about the DBQ, the document-based question. The document-based question gives you 7 documents that you then have to relate to a prompt. And in those documents, you might see some vocab, but there's no question style that involves just a list of vocab that you then have to relate to a prompt. But that could just be sort of a miscommunication about the document-based question. That's probably what my guess would be. Let's see. So do I think the DBQ will come up? I have no idea. As I said at the beginning of this whole thing, it's all speculation at this point. We got 45 minutes. That's not enough time to write a whole DBQ. Will they ask you to do a modified, smaller version? Maybe. Who knows? I think my guess is some SAQs, but I have nothing to support that other than that's what I would do. I think it's going to be 3 SAQs because they can do a variety of different kinds. Like they could do a historical interpretation, a primary source analysis, and then just a normal one. It makes sense given the time, but don't quote me on that because I have no idea. We just don't know. We're going to have to wait till April 3 when they announce the exam format. But it is always good to have those DBQ skills anyway. So Aries asking, can we get a review on period 7? Let's talk a little bit about period 7. So let me just go ahead and get rid of the slides and you can just come talk to me again here. All right. So period 7 goes from 1890 to 1945. This is a monster period. It includes a ton of topics, and we're going to get all sorts of things. What you don't want to do is get too lost in the weeds, and you want to make sure that you're able to sort of get the beginning and end dates. So 1890, close of the frontier, the United States begins to expand overseas. Foreign policy is a big deal during this time period. Goes all the way to 1945. That's the end of World War II. The United States is on top of the world and very involved in foreign affairs. So that's your overall thing. Within there, you're going to see things like imperialism. So the United States in the Spanish-American War, Philippine-American War, taking over Guam, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Philippines, Hawaii. You're going to see that happen. Included in period 7 is technically progressivism. And so the progressive reformers. So the people that are trying to change urban conditions, largely upper middle class white women who are the urban political reformers, but also presidents like Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, passing everything from the the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Reserve, passing other legislation like creating more national parks, conservation, trying to make sure that there's the Clayton Antitrust Act that enforces the Sherman Antitrust Act, things like that. So in my mind, the progressives really belong with period 6 because it's dealing with all the problems of the Gilded Age, but it's technically part of period 7 as well. Then you get into World War I, which is continuing U.S. expansionism. So the United States gets involved in World War I, and because you should know the causes of that, how it changes us at home. Think Sedition and Espionage Acts, Schenck v. United States, and then we do not join the League of Nations afterwards. We are relatively isolationist afterwards. The United States has a brief period of, thanks for joining us, Tigist, appreciate it. The United States has a brief period of internationalism during World War I, but then we don't join the League of Nations. We're done. During the 1920s, we're largely isolationist. There's a lot of stuff happening at home. There's the first Red Scare, Red Summer, race riots, flappers, the Scopes Monkey trial, dealing with women's rights and prohibition during the 20s. So a lot of domestic stuff happening. Oh, my bad. Sorry, I missed that part of the chat. Ria, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it. Tigist, glad you're sticking around a little bit longer. Sorry, we're going a little bit overtime here. A little bonus APUSH content. The 20s is also going to see the United States engaged in limited international affairs. Think Kellogg-Briand Pact, the Five Powers Treaty, things like that. Then during the 30s, you're going to see the Great Depression happens starting in 1929. And the Great Depression tries to be addressed by Hoover at first, doesn't succeed very well. FDR takes over, New Deal happens, somewhat more successful, but doesn't really end the Great Depression because that's only going to be ended by World War II. So Great Depression, New Deal, pros and cons, people that liked it, people that didn't like it. Those are things you need to know. And then World War II, you need to be aware of why the United States gets involved, how the United States is very reluctant to get involved. So there's a bunch of disagreements. The Neutrality Acts, Charles Lindbergh against people like Dr. Seuss, who draws political cartoons arguing the United States should get involved. If you haven't seen political cartoons by Dr. Seuss about World War II, you absolutely should. They're awesome. And then World War II changes the United States in a variety of ways. Think of women getting involved in the work, Japanese internment, massive sacrifices on the home front, lots of people getting involved in the war effort to fight, to manufacture, and then the United States has the atomic monopoly by the end, and that's the end of period 7. All right, so that was period 7 kind of in a nutshell. Nia, sorry, we don't really have time to go over every single period, let's say. Let me see if I can carve out more time for that on April 1. So April 1, I believe, is our next time that we have a question and answer session, and I'll try to prepare a sort of brief overview of each of the periods, and that way we'll be able to sort of do that then. If you can't catch it then, always watch the recording on 5 Thanks for joining us, folks. Thanks for asking questions, for answering questions. Hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully it helped you review some stuff, got some general questions, and hopefully it got you doing some like, oh, I didn't know about that. I better review some of that, because political parties are a frequently asked question amongst my students, and I'm sure amongst some of you too. Thanks for joining us. Hope you folks are staying safe, staying sane. Please, please wash your hands, stay safe. We love you. Self-care is very important, even more so than APUSH, and I'm an APUSH teacher. So take care of yourselves. We'll see you next time back on a 5 video somewhat. Oh, wait. Mahfouz has a question. Wait, I shouldn't cut it off yet. Hold on. What is it? I'm waiting with bated breath. We're almost out of time. Hopefully he can type like he's running out of time. Hamilton reference. Gotta love that. Maria also wants a review on the periods. Yeah, sounds good. Let's do that on April 1. That'd be great. I love these questions and answer sessions. They're fantastic. A little bit of back and forth is good too. Mahfouz, any resources that you can give us that allows us to study dates? Yes, give me half a moment, and I will grab a document. I'll throw the link into the chat. I have a document that I share with my students. We actually have date quizzes on them sometimes. I'm not one of those teachers that loves a lot of like rote memorization, a lot of just plug and chug, drill and kill type stuff. That's really not cool. But in order to write good essays, you have to know some dates and be able to contextualize some stuff. So yeah, knowing dates is a really good idea. And Tigist, I mentioned this at the beginning of the stream, maybe you weren't here, but like starting with the periods themselves is a really good idea. And then going deeper, maybe by decade, maybe by president, things like that would be a good idea. Let's see here. I have my required dates for APUSH document pulled up here. Just waiting for the sharing part to load. The more dates you know, the better. I mean, honestly, you can't go wrong with those, but don't stress out about reviewing every single one. I would say sometimes they're more important than others, and you can see that a little bit in the document as well. All right, the document is going into the chat right now. Click on that. I'll also put it as a call to action, so that way you can click on that. This is going to be APUSH important dates. All right, you should be able to see a little green button at the bottom of the screen that says APUSH important dates, or click on the link in the chat. That'll lead you to the required dates for APUSH. Some of you are showing up there as anonymous animals. Fantastic. This is a lot of them. This is very ambitious, right? So there's a whole bunch of them there, but these are just some of the most important ones that I think are useful. There are some that are more important than others, but it's a good start if you want to just begin some of that. Hopefully that's helpful. All right. You folks have been fantastic. Thanks for sticking with me into overtime, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Perla, for page 2, when it talks about the presidents, I have my students memorize the presidents that are not crossed off, because those are the ones that I think are important. Don't get mad at me, people. And then, are the crossed out presidents after period 8? No. The crossed out presidents are mostly in period 4 and in period 6. A little bit of period 5 too. So technically for this year's APUSH exam, you don't really have to know anyone after Harry Truman. So that would be 34 through 45. So the last one you have to know is 33. So Knowing presidents is a good idea. It's not super, super, super essential, but I find it to be very helpful. That way you always, always, always know some SFI no matter when you are. You could know Eisenhower during the war. Yeah, I wouldn't say you have to, but if you know him from World War II as the Allied commander of D-Day, etc., sure, throw it in there. All right, I have to get going. Hope you folks have a fantastic rest of your day. We'll see you next time on Fiveable Somewhere. Have a great day.